My brother threw a DNA testing kit onto my lap at my own birthday dinner, loudly announcing to 50 wealthy guests that it was time to find out if I was just another man's mistake. He thought it was the ultimate humiliation. He had no idea that little plastic tube would soon strip him of his job, his mansion, and his freedom. My name is Audrey, 33 years old, and a forensic accountant. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the family scapegoat and had to smile through their toxic jokes. It was a humid Friday evening in July. My parents, Richard and Cynthia, had insisted on hosting my 33rd birthday dinner at the Oak Ridge Country Club. To outsiders, it looked like a generous gesture from loving parents. To me, it was just another performance. My family did not do anything out of love. They did things for an audience. The private dining room was packed with 50 of their closest country club associates, business partners, and local socialites. I was merely a prop in their perfect suburban play. The crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead, and the waiters circulated with expensive champagne. I sat at the center of the long mahogany table, wearing a simple black dress, trying to make myself as small as possible. I hated these events. I always ended up feeling completely alone, in a room full of people who supposedly knew me. Across from me sat my older brother Derek. At 35, Derek was the golden child. He was the acting vice president of my father's real estate firm, a title he earned simply by being born male and arrogant. Next to him was his wife Jasmine. Jasmine was a lifestyle influencer who spent her days taking photos of her designer bags and talking about her luxurious life. She was currently holding her phone up, making sure the lighting caught her diamond earrings perfectly. She never missed a chance to document how much better her life was compared to mine. Her phone was a constant weapon in our family dynamic. Just as the waiters began clearing the salad plates, Derek stood up. He clinked his silver fork against his crystal champagne flute. The room quieted down immediately. Everyone turned to look at the handsome heir apparent. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a brightly colored rectangular box. He walked over to me with a massive, arrogant grin on his face. "Happy birthday, Audrey," he announced, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent room. He tossed the box right onto my lap. It hit my legs with a soft thud. I looked down. It was an Ancestry DNA kit. I stared at the bold letters on the packaging, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. I looked back up at Derek, waiting for the punchline. "The whole family has always wondered why you are so boring and plain." Derek continued, gesturing toward me with his glass. "We figured this might finally explain why you are just another man's mistake. Go on, find out who your real daddy is. Maybe he is the guy who delivers the mail." Laughter erupted from his side of the table. A few of the older guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but my father simply chuckled and took a leisurely sip of his expensive red wine. My mother, Cynthia, did not even flinch. She just smoothed her silk napkin over her lap and smiled thinly, enjoying the show. Jasmine immediately pointed her phone camera directly at my face, her red lips curved into a cruel smirk. She was broadcasting my humiliation live to her 50,000 followers. The air in the room felt incredibly thick and suffocating. My face burned with embarrassment, but I absolutely refused to give them the dramatic reaction they desperately wanted. "I am a forensic accountant. I deal with cold, hard facts for a living. I investigate fraud. I do not break down. I calculate my next move." I picked up the box. The plastic wrap crinkled loudly in the otherwise quiet dining room. I calmly peeled the seal back and opened the kit. I pulled out the small plastic swab. Derek's smirk faltered just a fraction as he watched me. Without breaking eye contact with my brother, I rubbed the swab against the inside of my cheek for 10 agonizingly long seconds. I carefully placed it into the sterile vial, snapped the cap shut, and handed the sealed tube directly back to him. "Thanks, Derek," I said, my voice completely steady and devoid of emotion. "I will mail it tomorrow." Derek stared at the plastic tube in his hand as if it had suddenly caught fire. He expected tears. He expected me to storm out so he could play the victim. When I did not give him that satisfaction, he scoffed and tossed the vial onto the table next to the butter dish. My mother let out a loud, dramatic sigh. "For heaven's sake, Audrey," she said, rolling her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. "Stop being so sensitive. Derek is just playing around. You always make everything tense and uncomfortable for the rest of us. Can you not just take a joke for once?" Before I could respond, a bright flash blinded me. Jasmine shifted her chair closer. Her phone held high. She was running her mouth to her 50,000 Instagram followers, her voice dripping with that fake sugary sweetness she used to mask her cruelty. "Hey guys!" Jasmine cooed into the camera, tossing her flawless dark braids over her shoulder. "We are at Oak Ridge celebrating my precious sister Audrey. Say hi now." "Say hi." "Actually, do not. She is giving us major bad vibes right now." Jasmine zoomed the camera lens into my face. She laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "We tried to spice up her birthday, but she is so stiff. And look at this dress. I swear she picked it up from a clearance rack. Who wears cheap polyester to a country club? Seriously, guys, tap the heart icon if I should take her shopping." A chorus of snickers erupted from the guests sitting nearby. I looked at Jasmine. Her wrists were stacked with designer bracelets and a massive diamond sparkled on her finger. What her followers did not know, and what I knew intimately from doing the company books, was that nearly everything Jasmine wore was funded by my father's business accounts under the guise of corporate marketing expenses. I offered a tight smile and took a sip of water. Let her have her digital applause. I knew the actual numbers behind her filtered life. The heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open, and the head waiter approached our side of the table. He carried a sleek black leather folder containing the bill. He respectfully placed it next to my father. Richard did not even open it at first. He patted his jacket pockets, acting as though this was a casual family dinner where he was the benevolent patriarch. But then he flipped the cover open. I watched his jaw tighten, his face turned a deep shade of crimson as his eyes scanned the itemized receipt. He glared across the table at Jasmine, then at Derek. $4,000 just on champagne, he hissed under his breath. Jasmine immediately lowered her phone and pouted her lips. "Only the best for family, Richard," she said innocently. We had to toast to Audrey. My father was furious, but he would never cause a scene and damage his precious reputation in front of his wealthy friends. He needed a scapegoat. He slid the black leather folder across the white tablecloth until it bumped against my water glass. "You ruined the mood, Audrey," he said coldly, refusing to look me in the eye. "You made everyone uncomfortable with your little stunt. You pay for it. Consider it your contribution to your own party since you clearly do not appreciate our efforts." The table went dead silent again. 50 pairs of eyes watched me, waiting to see if I would crack. A $4,000 dinner bill was meant to punish me. They knew my salary at the firm was deliberately kept lower than Derek. They assumed this would bankrupt me. I did not argue. I did not plead. I simply reached into my small leather clutch and pulled out my wallet. I retrieved my solid metal premium credit card. It hit the table with a heavy, satisfying clink. I placed it neatly inside the folder and slid it back toward the waiter who was hovering awkwardly nearby. "Do not worry about the limit," I told the waiter smoothly, making sure my voice carried across the table to my father and brother. "It is an unmetered card. 4,000 is barely a rounding error for me. Please make sure you add a 20% tip for yourself. You have had to deal with a very difficult crowd tonight." Derek watched, his mouth dropping completely open in sheer shock. My father stared at the dark metal card protruding from the folder, his eyes narrowing in confusion. They thought they controlled my finances. I calmly stood up, smoothed down my supposedly cheap dress, and picked up the DNA kit. "Thank you for the lovely birthday dinner," I finally said. "I have some very important mail to prepare tonight." Monday morning arrived with the sterile air of corporate entitlement. I walked into the lobby of Crestview Real Estate at 7. My father built this company, or so he reminded everyone. As a licensed forensic accountant, I was their independent financial consultant. In reality, I was the glorified janitor hired to clean up the borderline illegal financial trails my family left behind. My office was a small windowless room located next to the server closet, a stark contrast to the corner suites my father and brother occupied. I liked it that way. It allowed me to work without their constant micromanagement and endless daily interruptions. I had barely sat down when the heavy oak door of my office swung open so violently it slammed against the wall. Derek stormed in. He looked completely unbothered by the tense ending to my birthday dinner. He marched up to my desk and threw a thick manila folder onto my keyboard. "Sign off on this immediately," he demanded, adjusting his tailored suit cuffs. "I need the reimbursement wired to my personal account by noon. Jasmine has her eye on a new car and needs the down payment." I pushed my chair back and picked up the folder. I opened it and began scanning the itemized receipts. My eyes narrowed. It was an expense report for his recent business trip to Dubai. The total amount requested for reimbursement was $150,000. First-class flights on Emirates, a luxury penthouse suite at the Burj Al Arab, receipts for designer boutiques, spa treatments, and private yacht rentals, all vaguely labeled as client entertainment. There were absolutely no clients in Dubai. Our company had never once done international business. Jasmine had posted the entire trip on her Instagram, tagging it as a romantic getaway to celebrate their anniversary. I closed the folder and looked up at him. "I cannot authorize this." His smug expression vanished. "Excuse me, this is not a business expense," I explained, keeping my voice level. "This is a personal vacation. You are attempting to use $150,000 of company funds to pay for your wife to go shopping. If I sign my name to this ledger, I am legally endorsing tax fraud and opening myself up to federal investigation." Derek slammed his hands flat on my desk, leaning over to intimidate me. "You do not get to say no to me, Audrey. You work for us. You are a glorified calculator. Dad told you to process my expenses. My father authorized $50,000 for you to scout potential foreign investors," I corrected him. "You tripled that budget on luxury goods. My ethical obligation is to the IRS, and the law, not your fragile male ego." Derek's face flushed with rage. "You really think you have any power here?" he sneered, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "You are nothing. Dad only keeps you around because it looks good to have the pathetic daughter on the payroll. If you do not sign that paper right now, I will have you fired today." I stared at him. The sheer arrogance was staggering. He truly believed the rules did not apply to him or his perfect lifestyle. While he was standing there screaming at me, my right hand was resting casually on my mouse. My computer monitor was angled away from his line of sight. Behind the open spreadsheet, a progress bar was silently filling up. I had plugged a heavily encrypted flash drive into my computer the moment I arrived. While Derek ranted, I was actively downloading not just his Dubai receipts, but his entire history of fraudulent corporate spending over the last 4 years. Every hidden offshore transfer, every fake vendor invoice, every single dime he stole. "Go ahead," I challenged him, my voice completely devoid of fear. "Tell Richard I refuse to commit federal wire fraud for you. Let us see how he reacts when he finds out you spent company money on diamond necklaces instead of property acquisitions." I slid the manila folder across the smooth wooden desk until it fell off the edge and hit his expensive leather shoes. "Get out of my office, Derek. Take your garbage with you." He stared at me, his chest heaving with fury. He snatched the heavy manila folder off the floor with a violent, dramatic gesture. "You are going to regret this," he spat, turning on his heel and storming out of the room. The door slammed shut. I looked back at my computer screen. The progress bar hit 100%. The transfer completed. I safely ejected the small metal flash drive, slipped it securely into the hidden zippered pocket of my leather purse, and just smiled. I had exactly what I needed. 6 long weeks passed in a tense and incredibly quiet standoff at the firm. Derek completely avoided my office and my entire department floor, choosing instead to glare at me during weekly board meetings, while my father continued to treat me like an invisible nuisance. I kept my head down, doing my job and waiting. It was a terribly rainy Tuesday evening in late August when the fateful email finally arrived in my inbox. I was sitting at my kitchen island in my modest two-bedroom apartment eating takeout pad thai and reviewing a stack of quarterly tax projections. My phone buzzed on the granite countertop. The notification screen lit up with a simple message from the DNA testing company stating that my results were ready to view. I put down my chopsticks. My hands felt unusually cold as I picked up the phone. I told myself it was just a formality. I expected to see a mundane breakdown of European heritage and a confirmed link to my father lineage. Nothing more. I opened my laptop and logged into the secure online portal. The screen loaded slowly, revealing a colorful pie chart of my ethnicity. 50% Western European, 30% Scandinavian, 20% unknown. I scrolled past the colorful graphics, my eyes searching for the specific tab labeled Family Matches. I clicked it. The page refreshed. I stared at the top of the screen. My heart completely stopped. The platform displayed a list of close relatives based on shared centimorgans. The first section was reserved for immediate family members like parents and siblings. My mother, Cynthia, had taken this exact same brand of DNA test 5 years ago during a brief genealogy phase. Her profile was there, confirming a 50% match. I was definitely her biological daughter. I breathed a sigh of relief. But then I looked for my father. Richard had also taken the test alongside my mother back then. His profile should have been sitting right next to hers. It was not. I typed his name into the search bar within my match list. The system returned 0 results. 0% shared DNA. The screen glared back at me with the undeniable biological truth. Richard was not my father. A wave of nausea washed over me. For a moment the room seemed to tilt. My entire life, my identity as the scapegoat of this specific family, the endless attempts to win the approval of a man who treated me like dirt, it was all built on a massive lie. My mother had an affair. She lied to Richard. She lied to me. Derek truly was the golden child, the only legitimate heir, and I was exactly what he had jokingly called me at my birthday dinner. I was another man mistake. I forced myself to breathe. I took a sip of water to wet my suddenly dry throat. If Richard was not my father, who was? I looked back at the screen. Right below my mother name, occupying the slot for my biological father, was a name I did not immediately recognize. The profile was managed by a legal entity, not a personal user. It read Estate of Vincent Harrington. The match was a confirmed 50%. I opened a new tab on my browser and typed the name Vincent Harrington into the search engine. Millions of results instantly populated the screen. I clicked on the first link, a major financial news network obituary from 3 years ago. The headline read, Vincent Harrington, legendary real estate tycoon and self-made billionaire, dead at 78. The article detailed his massive empire, his ruthless business tactics, and his staggering net worth. It also highlighted a very specific tragic detail about his personal life. Vincent Harrington died entirely alone, leaving behind no wife and officially no children to inherit his massive fortune. I stared at the photograph of the imposing silver-haired man accompanying the article. I looked at his eyes. I looked at the shape of his jaw. Then I looked at my own reflection in the dark window of my kitchen. The resemblance was undeniable. The emotional shock hit me like a physical blow. The betrayal, the lies, the magnitude of who I actually was threatened to overwhelm me. My hands shook uncontrollably as I finally closed the digital newspaper article on my laptop. I desperately wanted to scream out loud in my empty kitchen. I truly wanted to call my mother and demand some real answers right now. But the forensic accountant inside me quickly took over. Emotion is messy. Emotion makes mistakes. Data is pure. Data is leverage. I wiped a single tear from my cheek and opened a fresh encrypted spreadsheet. I did not need to cry. I needed to audit my mother. I cleared the takeout containers off my kitchen island and brought out my heavy-duty work laptop. This was the encrypted machine I used for high-level corporate investigations. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I logged into the premium background check databases and federal public record archives I had access to through my firm. I typed in my maiden name, Cynthia Lawson. I set the search parameters to look back 35 years. I needed to know exactly who she was and what she was doing right before I was born. The initial results were sparse, just old address histories and minor credit inquiries. I dug deeper, pulling up archived state employment records and corporate filings from the late 80s. It took me 3 exhausting hours of cross-referencing old data before I finally found the golden thread. It was an archived employee registry from a massive commercial real estate conglomerate based in Manhattan. The company name was Harrington Enterprises. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I leaned closer to the bright glowing screen. 34 years ago, my mother was not the sophisticated suburban socialite she pretended to be. She was merely a 22-year-old executive assistant. And according to the corporate hierarchy chart I managed to unearth from an old filing, she reported directly to the CEO. She was the personal assistant to the billionaire Vincent Harrington. The timeline aligned perfectly. She worked for him for exactly 11 months. Then her employment record abruptly ended. 6 weeks after her sudden departure from Harrington Enterprises, she married Richard. Richard was just a 24-year-old struggling junior leasing agent at a completely different failing brokerage firm. He had no money, no connections, and terrible credit. Yet somehow within 2 months of their quick courthouse wedding, Richard suddenly had the capital to launch Crestview Real Estate. My father always bragged that he built his company from the ground up with nothing but elbow grease and a small business loan. I pulled up the original incorporation documents for Crestview Real Estate. I looked at the initial capitalization records. There was no bank loan. The seed money came from a single massive cash injection. I needed to trace the origin of that cash. I switched tabs and accessed a specialized financial database used to track historical asset transfers and large-scale tax events. I ran a targeted search on Cynthia Lawson for the tax year she married Richard. The search took a full minute to process. When the results finally populated, I let out a sharp gasp. There it was. A single IRS form declaration filed just days before her wedding. My mother had declared a massive one-time payment of $2 million. The source of the funds was listed under a highly restrictive non-disclosure agreement, categorized simply as an independent consulting fee. The payer was a private offshore holding company connected to Harrington Enterprises. I did not need a confession to understand what I was looking at. As a forensic accountant, I recognize hush money when I see it. Vincent Harrington had paid my mother $2 million to go away. She got pregnant. He wrote a check and she found a desperate, ambitious young man named Richard to play the role of the proud father. The entire foundation of my family was a transactional illusion. Richard did not build an empire. He bought a pregnant bride who came with a $2 million dowry. He used my biological father money to make himself rich, and in exchange he agreed to raise me. But he resented me every single day of my life, because looking at me was a constant reminder that his wealth was not his own. I was the living, breathing proof that he was nothing more than a paid placeholder. And Derek was born 2 years later. He was Richard's actual biological son. That was why Derek was the golden child. That was why they let him drain the company accounts to fund Jasmine's lavish lifestyle. They were a real family, and I was just the funding source they had legally absorbed. The sheer audacity of it all was staggering. They had spent my entire life treating me like a worthless burden, demanding my gratitude and punishing me for existing. Yet every brick of their mansion, every drop of champagne they drank at the country club, and every designer suit Derek wore was paid for by the blood running through my veins. I closed the financial database and opened a new secure folder on my desktop. I named it Project Karma. I began saving every tax return and corporate filing. They thought I was just the scapegoat. They did not realize they had trained the perfect auditor tonight. The files began piling up inside my newly created Project Karma folder. Each PDF document I saved felt like another brick being removed from the fortress of lies my family had constructed around me. I spent the next 4 hours doing what I do best. I followed the money. I tracked the original $2 million payment from the offshore holding company linked to Vincent Harrington directly into a joint checking account opened by Cynthia and Richard just 3 days after their wedding. It was a meticulously executed financial cover-up. For my entire life, Richard had paraded around the country club giving arrogant speeches about the value of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. He loved to tell his wealthy friends how he built Crestview real estate through sheer grit, long nights, and unmatched business acumen. It was all a complete fabrication. The seed money, the operational capital, the down payments on his very first commercial properties, every single cent of it was blood money paid to keep my existence a secret. They had monetized my abandonment. They traded my biological father for a startup fund. As the sun began to rise, casting a gray light through my kitchen window, I pulled up the current financial statements for Crestview Real Estate. I needed to see exactly what they had done with my $2 million over the last 3 decades. The company was currently valued at roughly $40 million on paper. But paper valuations are incredibly deceptive. I dug into their liabilities. My father and Derek had terrible spending habits. They were deeply over-leveraged. They treated the company treasury like a personal piggy bank, taking out massive corporate loans to fund their lavish personal lifestyles, their luxury cars, and the sprawling mansion they refused to downsize. The company was barely staying afloat, suffocating under the weight of $15 million in high-interest commercial debt. They were one bad quarter away from total bankruptcy. And yet they treated me, the very source of their initial wealth, like a parasite draining their resources. The irony was so sharp, it almost made me laugh out loud in the empty apartment. Right at that moment, my cell phone buzzed loudly against the granite countertop, breaking the absolute silence of my kitchen. I picked it up. The screen lit up with a new text message from Jasmine. I opened it. It was a high-resolution photograph of a diamond-encrusted watch resting on her manicured wrist. The watch was a limited edition piece, easily recognizable to anyone familiar with high-end jewelry. Beneath the photo was a text message dripping with her signature venom. Jasmine wrote, "Derek just surprised me with this little beauty to celebrate his amazing quarter at work. $50,000 of pure perfection. It is so nice to be married to a man who actually generates company profits instead of just counting other people's money all day. Maybe if you worked a little harder and smiled more, you could afford something nicer than that cheap dress you wore to your own birthday dinner. Have a great day at the office, Audrey." I stared at the glowing screen. A year ago, a message like this would have ruined my entire week. I would have felt the familiar sting of inadequacy and unfairness. But today, reading her petty insult felt like reading a confession. Jasmine was not taunting me with her wealth. She was actively handing me the exact evidence I needed to destroy them. I did not reply immediately. Instead, I immediately logged into the Crestview Real Estate internal banking portal. I checked the main operational account, the one specifically designated for payroll and vendor payments. I carefully hit refresh. A brand new outgoing wire transfer appeared at the top of the ledger. It was a transfer for exactly $54,200, including sales tax. The payee was a luxury jeweler located in downtown Boston. Derek had not used his personal funds or even a legitimate bonus check. He had directly wired the money out of the company operational budget to buy his wife a watch right before payroll was due to clear. It was blatant, undeniable corporate theft. I took a high-resolution screenshot of the wire transfer and dragged it directly into my Project Karma folder. Jasmine thought she was showing off her status. In reality, she was providing the final nail in her husband's coffin. I closed my laptop, walked into my bathroom, and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself closely in the bright bathroom mirror. I was not Richard's daughter. I never truly was. I was the daughter of a billionaire titan, and I was finally going to take back every single thing they stole from me. The next morning I walked into the Crestview real estate office with my head held high. I barely set my coffee down when my desk phone rang. It was the secretary instructing me to report to his suite immediately. I grabbed my company laptop, tucked it under my arm, and walked down the hallway. When I pushed open the doors of Richard's office, I found exactly what I expected. Richard sat behind his massive desk, his hands steepled tightly in front of him. Derek stood by the window, a smug smile plastered firmly across his privileged face. "Close the door, Audrey," Richard ordered, not even bothering to look up from his papers. I closed the door behind me and stood perfectly still in the spacious room. I did not sit down. "Derek came to see me yesterday afternoon," Richard began, leaning back in his leather chair. "He told me about your little insubordination regarding his travel expenses. We also discussed your hostile attitude toward this family and this company." "My attitude toward this company is strictly professional," I replied evenly. "I refuse to authorize an illegal misappropriation of corporate funds. Derek spent $50,000 yesterday on a diamond watch for his wife using the payroll account. That action is not insubordination. That is basic financial compliance." Richard slammed his hand on the desk. The sound echoed in the room. "You do not dictate compliance to me in my own building. I built this company. I make the rules. Derek is the vice president. His expenses are approved by me regardless of what they are. Then you are an accomplice to federal wire fraud," I stated calmly. Derek scoffed, stepping away from the window. "Listen to her, Dad. She thinks she is running the IRS. She is bitter because she is a bookkeeper making a fraction of what I make. She is toxic." Richard nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me. "Derek is right. You have become a liability, Audrey. Your jealousy is clouding your judgment and disrupting the workflow of my team. Effective immediately, your consulting contract with Crestview Real Estate is terminated." He paused, clearly waiting for me to break down. He expected tears, begging, or apologies. Instead, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was free from their daily torment. "I understand," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Richard looked confused by my lack of emotion. "Leave your security badge and your company laptop on my desk," he demanded harshly. "You have 10 minutes to pack up your personal belongings and leave the premises. Security will escort you out." I walked forward and placed the laptop onto his polished desk. I unclipped my ID badge and set it on top of the keyboard. I had wiped the computer completely clean an hour ago. Every piece of evidence was encrypted on the flash drive currently hidden in my pocket. "There is one detail you should know before I leave," I said, taking a step back and looking into his eyes. "As a licensed, certified public accountant, I am bound by a strict code of professional ethics." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" "When I uncover financial discrepancies, unrecorded liabilities, and direct evidence of embezzlement within a corporate entity, I am legally obligated to report my findings to the Internal Revenue Service." I smiled thinly. "And I assure you, Richard, I am a very thorough accountant." The smug look instantly vanished from Derek's face. He turned pale. "You are bluffing," he stammered. "I am not," I replied simply. Richard stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the credenza. He marched around his desk, his face red with sudden panic. "You listen to me, you ungrateful brat!" he shouted, pointing a thick finger at my face. "You will not say a word to anyone. I put a roof over your head. I fed you. You owe me everything." I turned toward the exit. "I owe you absolutely nothing." Richard lunged forward and positioned his large frame directly in front of the heavy wooden doors, physically blocking my exit. "Give me your phone," he demanded, his voice shaking with desperate anger. "You are not leaving this room until I know what you have copied." I stopped just a foot away from him. I looked him up and down with absolute disgust. "If you do not step away from that door in exactly 3 seconds, I will dial emergency services and report that I am being held hostage by a hostile former employer. Then I will file criminal assault charges against you." Richard stared at me, his chest heaving. He searched my eyes for any sign of hesitation or fear. He found none. Slowly trembling with rage, he stepped completely aside. I walked past Richard without a backward glance. The heavy doors of his office shut behind me with a solid, echoing thud. The administrative staff in the hallway stared at me in complete silence, having clearly heard the shouting. I simply adjusted my purse strap and walked toward the elevators. I did not feel defeated. I felt liberated. The drive back to my apartment was the most peaceful commute I had experienced in years. The suffocating weight of Crestview real estate was gone. When I unlocked the door to my apartment and dropped my keys on the granite counter, my cell phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a missed call from Derek, followed instantly by a voicemail notification. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and pressed play on the speakerphone. His voice filled the quiet room, dripping with his usual unearned arrogance. "Listen to me very carefully, Audrey." He began, his tone attempting to sound menacing but failing miserably. "Dad and I just had a long talk with our corporate attorneys. If you so much as breathe a word to the IRS or anyone else about my expense reports, we will personally sue you for defamation and corporate espionage. You have absolutely no proof of anything. You are just a bitter, fired employee who could not handle the pressure. Nobody will ever believe a jealous scapegoat over the vice president of a respected firm. Do yourself a favor and disappear quietly. Do not test us." The voicemail clicked off. I took a slow sip of my water and smiled. Derek was so incredibly predictable. He thought a generic legal threat would intimidate a forensic accountant who had his entire digital history resting in her pocket. He had no idea that I already held the keys to his destruction. Before I could even delete his pathetic message, my phone began ringing again. The caller ID displayed an unknown number from a Manhattan area code. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. My family usually preferred to barrage me with text messages when they were angry. I swiped the screen and answered the call. "Hello?" I said, keeping my tone strictly professional. "Am I speaking with Audrey Lawson?" a deep, commanding male voice asked. "This is she," I replied. "Who is calling?" "My name is Mr. Gallagher," the man said. His voice was smooth, but carried an undeniable authority, the kind that commanded immediate attention in high-stakes boardrooms. "I am the senior partner at Gallagher and Associates, and lead executor for the estate of the late Vincent Harrington." My breath caught sharply in my throat. I set my water glass down on the counter, so hard the ice clinked loudly against the sides. I had just discovered my connection to Vincent Harrington hours ago. "How did his legal team find me so quickly?" "I am listening, Mr. Gallagher," I managed to say, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Miss Lawson, I apologize for the abrupt nature of this call," he continued. "However, our firm utilizes a highly specialized legal monitoring software connected to several major genealogical databases. Late last night, your DNA results were processed and uploaded to their system. That event immediately triggered a Tier 1 legal alert on our end." A legal alert, I repeated, my mind racing through the implications. "Yes," Gallagher confirmed. "Vincent Harrington left behind a very complex and highly specific ironclad will. There are strict legal protocols I am bound by law to execute the moment a verified biological descendant is identified. I need to meet with you immediately to discuss your current standing within the Harrington Trust." I glanced at my encrypted laptop resting on the kitchen island. "I am currently between jobs as of an hour ago," I said wryly. "My schedule is completely open. When do you want to meet? I am currently in my vehicle heading toward your city." Gallagher replied without missing a beat. "I can be at your location by tomorrow morning at 9. I have already booked a private conference room at the Downtown Plaza Hotel. Please bring your government-issued identification and a certified copy of your birth certificate. This is a matter of extreme financial magnitude, Miss Lawson. I strongly advise you not to mention this conversation to anyone, especially Richard and Cynthia. They are the absolute last people I would ever tell," I assured him. "I will see you tomorrow at 9, Mr. Gallagher." I ended the call and stared at the blank phone screen. Derek thought he could threaten me with a baseless defamation lawsuit to protect his stolen $50,000. He had absolutely no idea that tomorrow I was going to inherit a billionaire empire. At 8:55 the next morning, I walked into the lobby of the Downtown Plaza Hotel. The atmosphere was a world away from the tacky aesthetic of the Oak Ridge Country Club. This was old money, quiet, understated, and intensely powerful. I took the private elevator up to the executive suites. A sharply dressed assistant guided me into a massive glass-walled conference room overlooking the city skyline. Sitting at the head of a long mahogany table was Mr. Gallagher. He was a distinguished man in his late 60s, wearing an impeccably tailored suit. He stood up immediately, offering a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Miss Lawson," he said, gesturing to the leather chair. "Please have a seat. We have a considerable amount of ground to cover." I sat down, placing my encrypted flash drive and my certified birth certificate neatly on the table. Gallagher inspected my documents with quiet efficiency. Once satisfied, he opened a thick leather-bound dossier. Before we discussed the financial architecture of the estate, he began, his tone softening just a fraction. "There is a personal matter I was instructed to clarify. Vincent Harrington knew you existed, Audrey. He knew from the very beginning." I felt a sharp ache in my chest. If he knew, why did he never reach out? Gallagher sighed heavily. "He tried. 34 years ago, your mother Cynthia threatened a massive public scandal right as Vincent was taking his company public. She demanded $2 million to walk away. She also demanded ironclad legal separation. She forced Vincent to sign binding non-disclosure agreements and preemptive restraining orders. If he ever made contact with you, he would have forfeited massive portions of his equity to her. He chose to protect his empire so he could eventually give it to you. He kept tabs on you your entire life. He knew about your accounting degree. He knew about your struggles with Richard." I stared at the skyline outside the window, processing the sheer magnitude of my mother's deception. She sold my biological father to protect her comfortable fake life with Richard. Gallagher turned a page in the dossier. "Vincent was a patient man," he continued. "He knew Cynthia and Richard were greedy. He knew they would eventually bleed their own resources dry. So he structured his estate to protect you when the time was right. Vincent left behind a highly confidential trust fund. The sole condition for activation was a verified DNA match, which you provided yesterday. As the lead executor, it is my duty to inform you that you are now the sole beneficiary of the Harrington Legacy Trust." I swallowed hard. "What exactly does the trust contain?" Gallagher looked me dead in the eye. "Liquid assets, corporate bonds, and prime real estate holdings totaling exactly $200 million. The number hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Yesterday, I was a fired accountant worrying about paying rent. Today, I was richer than everyone in that country club combined." I took a slow, deep breath, letting the reality of the money settle. But Gallagher was not finished. He slid a separate red folder across the polished wood. "There is one more specific asset contained within your trust," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Vincent wanted to ensure you had the ultimate leverage over the people who mistreated you. Over the past decade, Richard Business has taken on massive amounts of commercial debt. Whenever traditional banks rejected his loan applications, a private equity firm always stepped in to bail him out." I opened the red folder. I recognized the financial statements immediately. They were the loan documents for Crestview Real Estate. "Wait," I said, looking up at Gallagher. "The private equity firm that holds Richard debt is owned by the Harrington Trust." "Yes," Gallagher confirmed with a slight predatory smile. "The trust owns $15 million of Crestview debt. Furthermore, the trust holds the direct mortgages on their corporate office building and the private mansion where Derek and Jasmine currently reside. Since you now completely control the Harrington Trust, you are technically Richard's biggest creditor. You own their debt. You own their buildings. You hold the absolute power to foreclose on their entire fake empire today." A cold thrill rushed through my veins. The puzzle pieces snapped together just perfectly. My forensic accounting skills had clearly shown me that they were secretly broke. Vincent gave me the perfect weapon to legally execute their bankruptcy. Richard and Derek arrogantly thought they held all the cards. I closed the red folder. "Mr. Gallagher," I said, my voice steady, "I want to call in the debt. I want every single cent they owe me." Gallagher smiled broadly. "Let us prepare the legal summons right now." The legal machinery of a $200 million estate moves with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours of my meeting with Mr. Gallagher, the trap was fully set. We did not just send a polite email or a standard certified letter. Gallagher deployed professional process servers to deliver the documents simultaneously, ensuring my family could not coordinate their initial reactions. I sat in my quiet apartment sipping black coffee, imagining the exact moment the heavy cream envelopes with the embossed gold seal of Gallagher and Associates were thrust into their hands. The summons demanded their mandatory presence at the Harrington Trust headquarters by 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon for a comprehensive financial review of Crestview real estate debt obligations. The document was intentionally drafted in dense, intimidating legalese. It cited multiple breach of contract clauses regarding their $15 million commercial loan and demanded immediate accounting for corporate asset depreciation. It did not mention my name once. It did not mention Vincent Harrington, biological heir. It simply stated that the primary lien holder of their entire corporate structure required a face-to-face meeting to discuss imminent default protocols. The fallout was instantaneous. At exactly 11:15 on Thursday morning, my cell phone began ringing relentlessly. It was Richard. I let it ring 4 times before calmly pressing the green answer button. I did not say hello. I just listened. "Audrey, what in the world do you think you are doing?" Richard bellowed into the receiver, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw panic and absolute fury. "Do you honestly think hiring some fancy Manhattan law firm to bully me is going to work?" I remained completely silent, letting him dig his own grave. "You are suing us for wrongful termination, are you not?" He continued, his breathing heavy. "You stole confidential company data when you left, ran to a corporate shark, and now you are trying to extort your own family. Derek told me you were vindictive, but this is a new low even for you. You have absolutely no grounds for a lawsuit." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Are you finished, Richard?" "Listen to me, you ungrateful little witch," he snarled. "Crestview Real Estate has a rock-solid legal team. We will crush you in court. We will counter-sue you for corporate espionage, defamation, and breach of fiduciary duty. You will be paying my legal fees for the rest of your miserable life. Call off your attack dogs right now, or I swear to you I will make sure you never work in finance again." His threats were completely empty, the desperate flailing of a man who realized he was standing on a trapdoor. He thought this was about my tiny consultant salary. He had absolutely no idea he was dealing with the executioner of his entire empire. He truly believed he was fighting a fired employee, not a billionaire trust fund. "I am not calling off anything," I replied evenly, keeping my tone devoid of any emotion. "You received a legal summons from your primary creditor. I strongly suggest you show up tomorrow at 3 o'clock. If you default on this mandatory financial review, the consequences will be severe." I hung up the phone before he could scream another word. A profound sense of peace washed over me. For 33 years I had allowed this man to dictate my worth. Now he was sweating in his tailored suit, terrified of an invisible enemy. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated again. This time, it was a text from Derek. It read, "You are completely insane if you think you can take down Dad Company. Jasmine is in tears because of the stress you are causing this family. Drop the lawsuit, Audrey, before things get really ugly for you. You are messing with money you do not understand." I did not reply. Instead, I opened Instagram. Jasmine had just posted a cryptic text graphic on her story. It featured a black background with a sad face emoji and the words, "Dealing with incredibly toxic people today." Money really brings out the evil in some family members. Please send positive vibes, guys. She was already trying to spin the narrative, painting herself as the victim of my supposed greed. They were all operating under the shared delusion that this was a petty revenge plot over a fired accountant. They truly believed they held the superior legal position. They thought they could walk into that Manhattan boardroom, flex their suburban wealth, and intimidate my lawyers into a meager settlement. I walked right over to my bedroom closet and pulled out a sharp tailored navy blue suit. They wanted a financial review. I was going to give them a complete and utter liquidation. The navy blue suit hung perfectly on the closet door. I spent Thursday evening ironing my favorite silk blouse and organizing the printed financial dossiers into neat leather binders. I wanted my presentation tomorrow to be flawless. Just as I was placing the encrypted flash drive into my briefcase, the sharp chime of my doorbell echoed through my quiet apartment. I froze. I was not expecting any visitors. I walked softly into the hallway and pulled up the security camera application on my phone. The live video feed loaded, revealing two familiar faces standing on my welcome mat. It was Richard and Cynthia. They looked completely different from the arrogant people who had mocked me at the country club less than a week ago. Richard wore a wrinkled trench coat over his unbuttoned dress shirt, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. Cynthia looked frantic, her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. Richard reached out and pressed the doorbell a second time, his movements jerky and impatient. They were panicking. The legal summons from the Harrington Trust had clearly shattered their false sense of security. I took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open just a few inches. I stood firmly in the doorway, blocking their entry. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. Cynthia immediately burst into loud, dramatic tears. She lunged forward, trying to grab my hand, but I quickly stepped back. "Audrey, please!" she sobbed, her voice echoing down the empty apartment hallway. "You have to stop this. You have to call Mr. Gallagher and tell him it was all a huge misunderstanding. You cannot do this to your own family." I stared at her. Her performance was incredibly pathetic. "You received the mandatory summons," I stated simply. Richard pushed his way slightly in front of my mother. He looked exhausted, the dark bags under his eyes prominent in the dim hallway lighting. "Audrey, listen to reason," he pleaded, his voice stripped of its usual booming authority. "We know you are angry about being let go." Derek was out of line. I admit that. But running to the Harrington Trust, telling them about our internal financial struggles, that is corporate sabotage. If they pull our funding tomorrow, we lose everything. We lose the business, the house, our entire livelihood. You are actively trying to destroy the people who gave you a wonderful life. You are destroying your own legacy. I crossed my arms over my chest. Your legacy is built on stolen money and fraud, Richard. I am simply holding you accountable. Cynthia let out a high-pitched wail. She wiped her eyes, smearing her expensive mascara. "How can you be so incredibly cruel?" she cried, her face twisting with sudden vicious anger. "We took you in, we fed you, we paid for your college, we raised you, you owe us." I looked directly into my mother's eyes. The utter hypocrisy of her words was astounding. She had literally sold my biological father for $2 million, used that money to fund her lavish lifestyle, and then spent 33 years treating me like a burdensome charity case. "I owe you nothing," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You were paid $2 million to raise me, Cynthia. Do not ever act like I was an act of charity. I was a transaction. You made your deal 34 years ago, and now the bill has finally come due." Cynthia gasped, her face turning completely chalk white. The fake tears stopped instantly. She stared at me in sheer terror, realizing in that exact moment that I knew her darkest, most guarded secret. Richard looked back and forth between us, entirely confused by my statement about the $2 million. He had no idea what I was talking about because Cynthia had lied to him too. "Audrey, what are you talking about?" Richard demanded, his confusion momentarily overriding his panic. "What $2 million?" I did not answer him. I looked at Cynthia, watching the absolute horror dawn on her face. "Ask your wife, Richard," I said coldly. "Ask her about Vincent Harrington. I am sure she has a fascinating story to tell you on the drive back to your heavily mortgaged mansion." I stepped backward and slammed the heavy door shut right in their faces. I immediately turned the deadbolt, locking them out completely. I stood in the quiet hallway listening to Richard demanding answers from Cynthia on the other side of the wood. After a few minutes of muffled arguing, their footsteps finally faded away down the hall. I opened my phone and downloaded the security video. It was the perfect evidence of harassment to present to the lawyers at the meeting tomorrow afternoon. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and finally went to bed sleeping more soundly than I had in my entire life. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining brightly through my bedroom window. It was Friday, the day of the reckoning. I reached for my phone on the nightstand to check the time, but the screen was completely filled with notifications. There were dozens of missed calls, over 100 text messages, and an endless stream of social media alerts. My eyebrows furrowed in confusion. I unlocked the screen and opened the first text message. It was from my aunt. It simply read, "How could you be so utterly heartless to your own flesh and blood? You are a monster." I opened another message from a prominent member of the Oak Ridge Country Club. It read, "We always knew there was something wrong with you, Audrey. You should be deeply ashamed of yourself." I immediately opened Instagram to see what had triggered this sudden avalanche of hostility. Right at the top of my feed was a video posted by Jasmine. It already had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. I clicked on it. Jasmine was sitting on the floor of her massive walk-in closet, surrounded by her luxury handbags, wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt to make herself look fragile and small. She had completely removed her makeup and her eyes were red and puffy. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. "Hey guys," Jasmine whispered into the camera, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sorrow. "I did not want to bring family drama onto this platform, but I am just so heartbroken, and I need your support today. As many of you know, my husband Derek and his father have worked tirelessly to build Crestview real estate. They poured their blood, sweat, and tears into creating a legacy. But right now, that entire legacy is under attack by someone we trusted." Jasmine paused, letting a single, highly choreographed tear roll down her cheek. She wiped it away with a trembling hand. "My sister-in-law Audrey has always struggled with deep jealousy. We tried to love her. We gave her a great job at the firm. We invited her to every family event. But yesterday she was let go from her position due to severe behavioral issues. And instead of moving on gracefully, she is trying to destroy us out of pure spite. She has launched a baseless, malicious legal attack against our family business. She is actively trying to bankrupt my husband and make us homeless just because she is bitter about her own life." The video cut to a different angle, showing Jasmine holding a crumpled tissue. "Please," she begged, looking directly into the lens with wide, innocent eyes. "Send prayers for Derek and Richard. They are dealing with a completely unhinged, toxic family member who wants to see us lose everything. Protect your peace, guys. Sometimes the most toxic people in your life are the ones sharing your dinner table." I watched the video loop back to the beginning. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. Jasmine had masterfully spun the narrative, turning my forensic discovery and the Harrington Trust summons into a pathetic tale of a jealous spinster trying to ruin her perfect marriage. She had preemptively painted herself as the ultimate victim. I scrolled through the comments section. It was an absolute echo chamber of blind support for Jasmine and visceral hatred directed at me. People I had known for years were calling me unhinged, dangerous, and pathetic. Her followers were leaving hundreds of angry emojis and demanding that I be publicly exposed. My phone vibrated again in my hand. It was another text from Derek. It said, "Look at what you did to my wife. The entire city knows exactly what kind of psycho you are now. Cancel the meeting today, or I will let her release a second video with all of your personal contact information." I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I did not feel hurt. I felt a deep, radiating sense of absolute satisfaction. They were spending their final hours of wealth digging a hole so deep they would never be able to climb out. I casually walked over to my kitchen island, poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and picked up my phone again. I methodically took high-resolution screenshots of the video, her captions, and every single hateful text message my family had sent me that morning. I saved all of it directly into the Project Karma folder. Every single lie she told her followers was just adding another layer of sweetness to the upcoming payoff. I smiled, locked my phone, and walked away to shower. I stepped out of the shower, letting the hot water wash away the last remnants of my old life. I dressed in the sharp navy blue suit I had prepared the night before, pulling my hair back into a sleek professional bun. I grabbed my leather briefcase containing the printed financial dossiers and the encrypted flash drive. By 2:15 in the afternoon, I was stepping out of an Uber in front of the towering glass skyscraper that housed Gallagher and Associates. The sheer scale of the building was a testament to the kind of power Vincent Harrington wielded. I walked into the grand marble lobby and took the private executive elevator up to the penthouse level. Mr. Gallagher was waiting for me. He looked pristine in a charcoal gray suit flanked by two imposing security guards. He guided me into the primary corporate boardroom. The room was massive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. In the center of the room sat a long, polished mahogany table, surrounded by heavy leather chairs. I took my seat at the far end of the table. I placed my briefcase on the floor and laid my phone face down next to me. I took a slow, deep breath. At exactly 2:55, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. My family walked in. They did not look like people arriving for a mandatory financial review with a major creditor. They looked like they were walking into a country club mixer. Derek led the pack, strutting into the room, wearing a brand-new custom-tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than my first car. He adjusted his silk tie and looked around the magnificent room with absolute arrogance, acting as if he was evaluating the real estate for his own portfolio. Jasmine trailed right behind him, carrying the exact same luxury handbag she had cried in front of on Instagram just hours ago. She wore large designer sunglasses indoors, playing the part of the harassed celebrity. Richard and Cynthia walked in last. Cynthia looked slightly nervous, her eyes darting around the expansive room, likely remembering my warning from the hallway the night before. But Richard appeared entirely unbothered. He puffed out his chest and marched straight toward my end of the table. He did not even acknowledge Mr. Gallagher or the security guards standing quietly by the walls. He looked directly at me with a mixture of pity and intense irritation. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, stapled document. He tossed it across the polished mahogany table. It slid smoothly over the wood and stopped exactly right in front of my hands. "I am a very busy man, Audrey." Richard began, leaning his heavy hands on the table and towering over me. "I do not have time for these dramatic stunts. I do not know which low-level ambulance chaser you managed to hire on contingency to draft that ridiculous summons, but it ends right now." I looked down at the document. The bold heading at the top read, "Full and final severance agreement and release of all claims." "That is a very generous offer." Richard continued, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet boardroom. "It guarantees you a $50,000 severance package. In exchange, you will immediately drop these silly little IRS threats. You will sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement regarding the company finances, and you will publicly apologize to Jasmine for the stress you caused her today. Sign the paper, take the money, and go find a new job. If you refuse, I will personally see to it that you spend the next 10 years drowning in legal fees." Derek scoffed from the sidelines, leaning casually against the expensive leather chair. "Just take the money, Audrey," he chimed in, crossing his arms. "You played a stupid game and you lost. Stop embarrassing yourself." Jasmine pulled down her sunglasses, giving me a look of pure disgust. "You are so toxic," she whispered loudly. "We are actually trying to help you, and you just want to destroy us." I did not touch the document. I did not break eye contact with Richard. They still truly believed they held the upper hand. They thought this massive boardroom belonged to some random law firm I had desperately hired. They had absolutely no idea that every single inch of this building, including the chair Derek was leaning on, was paid for by the Harrington Trust. I let the heavy silence stretch out, allowing their blind arrogance to fully saturate the large room. I was quietly savoring the final few seconds of their completely fake reality. "Are you quite finished with your pathetic performance now, Richard?" I asked smoothly. Richard's face instantly hardened. He slammed his fist onto the table. "Listen to me, you little ingrate!" he began to shout. But before he could utter another threat, the heavy wooden doors of the boardroom swung open. Mr. Gallagher strode into the room. He was no longer playing the polite host I had met yesterday. He was entirely in his element, radiating absolute corporate authority. He was flanked by two massive uniformed security guards who stepped inside and immediately took up positions by the doors, their expressions completely unreadable. Richard stopped yelling and turned around. He adjusted his suit jacket, puffing out his chest to reassert his dominance in the room. He assumed Gallagher was just a senior partner I had desperately hired to mediate my supposed severance. Richard walked toward the head of the table, extending his right hand with a practiced, arrogant smile. "Good afternoon," Richard said loudly. "I am Richard Lawson, founder and chief executive officer of Crestview Real Estate. I assume you are the attorney representing my former employee. Let us skip the formalities and wrap this up quickly. I have already presented her with a very generous offer." Mr. Gallagher did not even look at Richard's extended hand. He walked right past him, treating the self-proclaimed chief executive officer like an invisible piece of furniture. Gallagher approached the head of the mahogany table, unbuttoned his suit jacket, and took his seat. The two security guards shifted slightly, their presence a silent warning against any further outbursts. Richard stood there awkwardly, his hands still suspended in the air. A flush of deep embarrassment crept up his neck. He slowly lowered his arm and returned to his chair next to Derek, his arrogant demeanor slightly punctured. Jasmine stopped chewing her gum, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Gallagher opened his leather-bound dossier and arranged his papers meticulously. He looked up, his cold gaze sweeping across my family members before finally resting on Richard. "I am not here to represent a former employee in an employment dispute." Mr. Lawson Gallagher began, his voice deep and perfectly level. "My name is Arthur Gallagher. I am the senior partner at Gallagher & Associates. More importantly, for the purpose of this meeting, I am the lead legal executor for the estate of the late Vincent Harrington." The name dropped into the room like a lead weight. Cynthia gasped loudly. She slapped both of her hands over her mouth, her eyes widening in absolute terror. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. She slumped back against the heavy leather chair, as if all the bones in her body had suddenly dissolved. Richard looked at his wife, completely bewildered by her intense physical reaction. He turned back to Gallagher, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Vincent Harrington?" Richard repeated, his voice losing its booming confidence. "The billionaire. What does his estate have to do with my company?" "Everything," Gallagher replied simply. "We did not summon you here to discuss a $50,000 severance package. We summoned you here because the Harrington Trust has recently undergone a massive transition of power. Due to a legally binding contingency placed in Mr. Harrington's will, the entirety of his $200 million estate, including all private equity holdings, has been transferred to his sole biological heir." Gallagher paused, letting the staggering financial figure settle over the room. He then turned his head and looked directly at me. "I formally present to you the new head of the Harrington Trust, Miss Audrey Harrington." Dead silence filled the massive boardroom. For a long moment nobody moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then Derek broke the tension. He threw his head back and let out an obnoxious laugh. He clapped his hands together slowly, mocking the entire presentation. "Wow!" Derek chuckled, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "This is incredible. You actually hired an actor to play a billionaire lawyer. And you are claiming to be the secret heir to a real estate tycoon. Audrey, this is the most pathetic, desperate bluff I have ever seen in my entire life. Did you really think we would fall for this insane delusion? Mr. Gallagher did not raise his voice. He did not argue with Derek. He simply reached into his dossier and pulled out a thick stack of papers bearing the official red seals of the federal court and the certified genetic laboratory. He slid the documents firmly across the polished mahogany table. The papers glided effortlessly and stopped right under Derek's nose. Read the certified DNA results and the federal trust transfer documents, Gallagher instructed coldly, his sharp eyes locking onto my brother. Then tell me if you are still laughing. Derek stared at the heavy stack of documents. The arrogant smirk completely melted off his face. His hands actually trembled as he picked up the top sheet. He read the genetic laboratory certification, then flipped to the federal court order. He did not say a single word. He just slowly lowered the documents to the table, looking like all the air had been punched out of his lungs. Richard snatched the papers and scanned the pages. He reached the section detailing the $200 million value. The reality hit him hard. He looked up, his expression a mix of utter disbelief and sudden, sickening realization. Well, Richard stammered, his booming voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. It seems your mother kept quite a secret from all of us. But congratulations, Audrey. You stumbled into a massive fortune. However, this has absolutely nothing to do with Crestview Real Estate. You have your money now. Take your trust fund and go. Leave my business out of this. We will withdraw the severance offer and pretend none of this ever happened. Gallagher leaned forward. You fundamentally misunderstand your current predicament. Mr. Lawson, Gallagher stated, his tone chillingly polite. This meeting is not a family reunion. It is a mandatory creditor review. The Harrington Trust is deeply intertwined with your business. Richard scoffed. That is impossible. My company is completely independent. We have lines of credit through a private equity firm, not some billionaire personal trust. Gallagher reached into his leather dossier and extracted the bright red folder. He flipped it open, revealing copies of Richard master loan agreements. The private equity firm you are referring to is Apex Capital Holdings, Gallagher said smoothly. Apex Capital Holdings is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Harrington Trust. Every single dollar you have borrowed over the last decade originated from Vincent Harrington. And as of yesterday morning, the sole proprietor of Apex Capital Holdings is Miss Audrey Harrington. Therefore, she is your primary creditor. Jasmine let out a sharp, confused gasp. What does that mean? Derek, she whispered frantically. What is he talking about? Derek ignored her, his eyes glued to the red folder. It means, Gallagher continued, projecting his voice, that Miss Harrington personally owns the $15 million commercial loan keeping your failing company afloat. Because that loan is fully secured by your corporate assets, she holds the primary lien on your entire operation. Furthermore, since your son and his wife reside in a property technically owned by Crestview Real Estate, Miss Harrington holds the direct mortgage on their private mansion as well. She effectively owns the roof over your heads and the chairs you are currently sitting on. Richard jumped up from his leather chair, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. You cannot do this, he roared, slamming both hands onto the table. That is an active loan. We make our minimum monthly interest payments on time. You cannot just arbitrarily call in a commercial debt of that magnitude without cause. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years. We have not defaulted. Gallagher did not even blink at the outburst. He simply turned to the third page of the loan agreement and tapped his expensive pen against a specific highlighted paragraph. Actually, Mr. Lawson, you have defaulted. Gallagher corrected him with lethal legal precision. Section 4, paragraph B of your master promissory note explicitly states that any gross violation of corporate governance, specifically the commingling of corporate funds for personal use, or the active embezzlement of capital, triggers an immediate breach of contract. That clause grants the lien holder the absolute right to demand full repayment within 24 hours. Should you fail to produce $15 million in liquid cash by tomorrow afternoon, Miss Harrington has the legal authority to seize all collateral assets immediately. Richard collapsed backward into his seat. His breathing became shallow and erratic. The invincible patriarch of the family was suddenly reduced to a terrified debtor realizing his entire empire was built on quicksand. He looked at Cynthia, who was silently weeping. The arrogant facade they had maintained for 3 decades was completely shattered. Derek finally found his voice. He leaned across the table, his face slick with sweat. "Audrey, please," he begged, his tone devoid of its mocking edge. "You cannot do this to us. This is our livelihood. If you call in that loan, the company goes bankrupt. We lose everything. You are family." I sat perfectly still in my chair. It was fascinating how quickly the word family became a shield. I looked directly at Richard and then at Derek. "You made it very clear that I was just a mistake," I replied softly. "Now you are finally going to learn exactly how much a mistake can cost." I pushed my chair back and stood up. The heavy silence in the boardroom was palpable as I picked up my encrypted flash drive from the mahogany table. I walked over to the sleek media console built into the wall and plugged the metal drive into the port. I tapped the touchscreen, and the massive projector lowered silently from the ceiling. The floor-to-ceiling windows automatically dimmed, casting the room in a sharp clinical light. "You asked what kind of cause I could possibly have to call in a $15 million commercial loan," I said, looking directly at Richard, who was still slumped in his leather office chair. "You claimed you make your minimum monthly interest payments on time. But you have absolutely no idea what is actually happening inside your own ledger." I pressed a button on the remote, and the first slide appeared on the massive screen behind me. It was a complex but clearly labeled forensic accounting flowchart. I had spent the entire night tracing every single unauthorized transaction from the past 4 years. "When you fired me yesterday to protect your golden child," I explained smoothly, pacing slowly at the head of the table, "you thought you were eliminating a jealous nuisance. Instead, you gave the newly minted head of the Harrington Trust the exact financial ammunition she needed." I clicked to the next slide. A massive number flashed onto the screen in bright red font. $3,500,000. Richard gasped, sitting up straight. "What is that number?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "That, Richard, is the exact amount of corporate capital your vice president has embezzled from Crestview Real Estate over the last 48 months, I stated, pointing the laser pointer directly at Derek. Derek gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning completely white. "Shut it off, Audrey," he hissed, a frantic sweat breaking out across his forehead. "You are lying. This is doctored evidence." I ignored his pathetic protests and clicked to the next slide. The screen filled with dozens of side-by-side images. On the left side were Crestview Real Estate internal wire transfers, masked as payments to international construction contractors and material vendors. On the right side were high-resolution screenshots from Jasmine's Instagram account. "Let us look at your business trip to Dubai last month," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the large boardroom. Derek submitted a $150,000 expense report for client entertainment. However, my audit reveals that the money was wired to a shell company in the Cayman Islands and then immediately routed to luxury boutiques in the Emirates. I clicked the remote again. The $50,000 diamond watch Jasmine had flaunted via text message appeared on the screen right next to the corresponding fraudulent vendor invoice. "You did not buy that watch with company profits, Jasmine," I said, turning my gaze to my sister-in-law. "Your husband stole that money from the company payroll account just 3 days ago. Your entire luxury lifestyle, the designer bags, the first-class flights, the massive down payment on your mansion, it is all completely fake. It is funded exclusively by federal wire fraud and systemic corporate theft." Jasmine removed her designer sunglasses, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at the screen, then looked at Derek. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She was slowly realizing that she was not married to a successful executive. She was married to a prolific thief who had just been caught by a billionaire trust fund. Richard turned to his son, his face contorting with a mixture of absolute rage and profound betrayal. "Tell me she is lying, Derek," Richard demanded, his voice shaking violently. Tell me you did not steal $3.5 million from my company. Derek could not even look his father in the eye. He stared down at the polished wood of the table, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. He cannot deny it, I answered for him, walking back to my chair. Because I have already forwarded this entire encrypted dossier to my legal team. Every fake invoice, every offshore transfer, every piece of stolen capital is fully documented. I looked at Mr. Gallagher, who nodded in agreement. As the primary lien holder of Crestview Real Estate, I continued addressing the entire room. I am legally obligated to protect my financial interests from gross criminal mismanagement. I am officially pressing federal wire fraud and embezzlement charges against Derek. The authorities will be thoroughly reviewing these files. You called me a mistake at my birthday dinner, Derek. But I am the one who just handed you a guaranteed 10-year federal prison sentence today. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was Derek taking short, shallow breaths. He stared at the projection screen like a man watching the ground crumble beneath his expensive shoes. The reality of a 10-year federal prison sentence hung heavily in the sterile air. But the person who reacted first was not Derek or Richard. It was Jasmine. She slowly stood up from her heavy leather chair. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and crashed onto the floor, but she did not look down. She stared at Derek with an expression of pure horror. "You lied to me," Jasmine whispered, her voice shaking so badly it barely registered. "You told me you were earning those bonuses. You told me your father approved everything." "Jasmine, please," Derek croaked, reaching a trembling hand out toward his wife. "Let us just calm down and talk to the lawyers. We can figure this out." "Figure this out!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. Her perfectly curated influencer persona completely evaporated, leaving behind a furious, terrified woman. "Figure what out, Derek? You stole $3.5 million. You are not a wealthy executive. You are a common thief. You bought me a watch with stolen payroll money. What will this do to my brand? My entire life is on the internet. My followers will tear me apart." "Jasmine, you are my wife," Derek pleaded, his face pale and glistening with cold sweat. "You have to stand by me. We are a team." "A team." Jasmine laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made Cynthia flinch in her seat. "I married a vice president of a real estate firm. I did not marry a federal inmate. I am not going down with you. I am not losing my youth visiting you behind glass in a maximum security prison." Jasmine grabbed her left hand and began violently tugging at her finger. She pulled off the massive custom-designed diamond engagement ring Derek gave her 3 years ago. The ring cost him over $100,000 of stolen corporate capital. She threw it directly at his face. The heavy diamond struck him right on the cheekbone and clattered loudly onto the polished mahogany table before rolling onto the carpet. "I want a divorce!" Jasmine screamed at him, pointing a manicured finger directly at his face. "And I want my own legal counsel." She turned frantically toward Mr. Gallagher, her eyes wide with desperation. "I had absolutely no idea he was doing this. I thought the money was legitimate. You cannot hold me responsible for his crimes. I demand a lawyer right now." Mr. Gallagher did not flinch. He adjusted his glasses and looked at her with mild distaste. "I am the lead executor for the Harrington Trust, madam," he replied smoothly. "I am not a public defender. I suggest you retain your own criminal defense attorney immediately. Given the extent of the assets you have acquired with embezzled funds, the federal authorities will certainly be freezing your personal bank accounts by tomorrow morning." Jasmine gasped, taking a step back as if she had been physically struck. Her eyes darted wildly around the room until they finally landed on me. The vicious cruelty she displayed just hours ago on Instagram vanished completely. She smoothed down her oversized gray sweatshirt and forced a pathetic, trembling smile onto her face. "Audrey, please," Jasmine begged, stepping toward my end of the table. Her voice was suddenly soft and sweet, dripping with a sickeningly fake warmth. "You know how manipulative Derek can be. He lied to me just like he lied to you. We are sisters, Audrey. We always have been. You know I never actually meant those things I said on the internet. I was just stressed and confused. Please do not let them take my house. Please do not let them take my things. We can work this out together. I can help you testify against him. I looked at the woman who had spent 5 years mocking my clothes, mocking my salary, and making my life a nightmare. I looked at the woman who had just publicly branded me a toxic monster to 50,000 strangers this very morning. She was standing there with her hand outstretched, expecting my newly acquired billionaire status to somehow act as a shield for her own incredible greed. She actually expected the scapegoat to somehow save her. I picked up my laser pointer and calmly turned off the projector. The massive screen rolled quietly back into the ceiling. I looked directly into Jasmine's wide, panicked eyes. "We are absolutely not sisters," I replied coldly. "And you are currently trespassing on my private property. Security will escort you out immediately." The two security guards stepped forward from the heavy wooden doors. They flanked Jasmine on either side. One guard firmly grasped her upper arm, while the other picked up her handbag from the carpet. Jasmine thrashed against their grip, her sneakers slipping on the polished marble floor as she was dragged backward. She screamed my name. She screamed for Derek. She even screamed at Mr. Gallagher to stop them. Nobody moved a single muscle to help her. Derek remained frozen in his chair, completely numb to his wife being removed from the premises. The heavy doors clicked shut behind her, cutting off her frantic shrieks. The boardroom was suddenly plunged back into a suffocating silence. Only 3 members of my family remained. Derek was staring blankly at the wall, a hollow shell of the vice president who had mocked my birthday. But Cynthia was vibrating with raw panic. She looked at the empty space where her daughter-in-law had just been standing, then looked at me. The reality of her impending poverty finally broke her completely. Cynthia let out a sharp sob and threw herself out of her chair. She stumbled across the room and dropped heavily to her knees right beside my chair. Her hands reached out, clawing at the fabric of my skirt. "Audrey, my girl, please." Cynthia wailed, her voice thick with terror. "You cannot let them take our home. You cannot put your father and your brother on the street. We are your family. I am your mother. I brought you into this world. I protected you. You have a good heart. You are not a cruel person. Please, you have to show us mercy." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. "You did not protect me, Cynthia," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly to where Richard was sitting. "You sold me." Cynthia shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. "No, you do not understand," she pleaded, her desperation overriding any remaining sense of self-preservation. "I did it for us. I took the $2 million from Vincent so we could have a good life. I had to sign those non-disclosure agreements to get the money. Vincent forced me to keep you a secret from him, but I used every single penny of that hush money to build the life we have now. I bought this family everything. I made Richard who he is. I did it all for you." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Behind Cynthia, a heavy scraping sound echoed across the floor. Richard slowly stood up from his chair. His face was a mask of absolute horror and complete devastation. He stared down at his wife, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the monumental betrayal that had just spilled from her own mouth. "What did you just say?" Richard whispered, his booming voice reduced to a fragile, trembling rasp. "What $2 million, Cynthia?" Cynthia froze. She slowly turned her head and looked up at her husband, suddenly realizing exactly what she had just confessed in front of him. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a fish gasping for air. Richard stepped closer, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He looked like a man who had just discovered his entire existence was an intricate illusion. "You told me the seed money for Crestview real estate came from a private inheritance from your late grandmother," Richard hissed, stepping over to her. "You told me Audrey was the product of a brief fling with a college boyfriend. You mean to tell me that my entire company, my entire legacy was built on hush money from Vincent Harrington?" You made me raise another man-child, a billionaire child, and you kept the money a secret. Cynthia scrambled backward away from him, her heels slipping on the carpet. Richard, please, she cried, raising her hands to protect her face. I had to do it. You were completely broke. You had terrible credit. You were a failing leasing agent who could not even afford rent. I made you a CEO. I gave you an empire. You would be absolutely nothing without my money. The truth finally stripped away Richard's ego. He lunged forward, his face contorting with blinding rage. He screamed at her, calling her a manipulative parasite. Cynthia screamed back, calling him a pathetic, ungrateful failure who only succeeded because she bought his career. They viciously tore each other apart right there on the boardroom floor, trading 34 years of toxic lies and buried resentments. Mr. Gallagher watched the mutual destruction with quiet satisfaction. I simply sat in my chair, watching the empire of lies burn to ashes. The screaming match between Richard and Cynthia echoed violently off the thick glass windows of the boardroom. They hurled insults and bitter accusations, completely forgetting where they were and who was watching them. Richard's veins bulged against his neck as he called her a lying parasite. Cynthia shrieked back, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the carpet, cursing his financial incompetence. It was a pathetic, ugly display of two people who had built their entire identities on a mountain of stolen money and deceit. I watched them tear each other apart for exactly 2 minutes. Then I decided I had seen enough. Enough, I said. I did not shout. I did not need to. My voice, calm and completely devoid of emotions, sliced straight through their hysterical screaming. Richard snapped his mouth shut, his chest heaving violently. Cynthia clamped her hands over her face, sobbing into her palms. They both looked up at me from the floor, thoroughly broken and entirely defeated. They finally understood the absolute power dynamic in the room. Mr. Gallagher stepped forward from his position near the wall. He walked to the center of the mahogany table, holding an elegant black leather portfolio. He opened it carefully and extracted 3 thick legal documents, laying them out in a neat row directly in front of my chair. He handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. As the sole proprietor of the Harrington Trust and the primary lien holder of Crestview Real Estate, Mr. Gallagher announced smoothly, his voice filling the sudden quiet. You have the absolute legal authority to execute these immediate actions based on the documented federal wire fraud and gross breach of contract. I took the heavy gold pen from his hand. The metal felt cool and solid against my fingers. I looked down at the first document. It was a formal termination notice drafted with lethal corporate precision. This first document, I stated clearly, looking directly at my brother, who was still slumped in his leather chair, is the immediate and unconditional termination of Derek Lawson from his position as vice president. Because you committed felony embezzlement, you are being fired for gross misconduct. You will receive no severance, no benefits, and your corporate shares are hereby seized to partially offset the stolen funds. Derek flinched, as if I had physically struck him, but he said absolutely nothing. I signed my name on the bottom line with a swift, definitive stroke. I moved my pen to the second document. The bold heading outlined a demand for immediate loan repayment. This is the formal execution of the default clause on your $15 million commercial loan, I explained, shifting my gaze down to Richard. You have exactly 24 hours to produce the total sum in liquid cash. Since my forensic audit proves you do not even have a fraction of that amount, this document effectively initiates the hostile takeover and immediate liquidation of Crestview Real Estate. Your company is officially bankrupt, Richard. It belongs to me now. Richard let out a hollow, agonizing groan. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against the carpet, his hands clutching his graying hair. I signed the second document without a single ounce of hesitation. I slid the third and final document toward me. This one was a formal eviction notice. And this, I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, icy tone, is a 24-hour notice to vacate the premises of the company-owned mansion located in the Oak Ridge subdivision. The property is being repossessed by the Harrington Trust. You and Jasmine have until tomorrow afternoon to remove your personal belongings, or they will be seized as collateral by federal authorities. I signed the third document and carefully placed the gold fountain pen back onto the polished wood. The execution was complete. With 3 simple signatures, I had entirely dismantled the fake empire that had caused me 33 years of misery. I had stripped them of their money, their status, their home, and their pride. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and buttoned my navy blue suit jacket. I picked up my briefcase from the floor. Richard and Cynthia remained frozen on the carpet, unable to even look at me. I walked slowly around the long mahogany table, my heels clicking sharply against the floorboards, until I reached the spot where Derek was sitting. He looked up at me. His arrogant, privileged face was pale, sweaty, and completely devoid of hope. The golden child was finally facing the consequences of his own actions. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face just inches from his. "I guess I am not the mistake after all," I whispered. I turned my back on them forever and walked right out of the room without looking back. 2 days later, the reality of my signatures materialized in the pristine, manicured streets of the Oak Ridge subdivision. I did not need to be physically present to witness the collapse of their fake world. The asset recovery firm I hired provided real-time video documentation for all high-value corporate seizures. I sat comfortably at my kitchen island, drinking my morning coffee, and opened the secure link on my laptop. The live video feed loaded instantly. The camera angle was positioned from the dashboard of a heavy-duty commercial tow truck, idling quietly at the end of a long cobblestone driveway. At the top of the driveway sat the sprawling 6-bedroom mansion Crestview Real Estate had purchased for Derek and Jasmine. The front door was wide open. Jasmine was sprinting back and forth across the pristine front porch. She was completely frantic. She was no longer wearing her perfectly curated influencer outfits. She wore plain gray sweatpants and a messy bun. Her arms were heavily loaded with dozens of brightly colored luxury handbags. She was aggressively tossing Hermes and Chanel bags into the open trunk of her matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. She was desperately trying to secure her stolen inventory before the 24-hour eviction deadline expired. The tow truck driver put his vehicle into gear and slowly rolled up the driveway. The loud rumble of the diesel engine shattered the quiet suburban morning. Jasmine froze. She dropped a bright pink leather bag onto the concrete and spun around to face the massive truck. The driver stepped out wearing a high-visibility vest and holding a thick metal clipboard. He did not look intimidated by the expensive surroundings. "Excuse me," Jasmine screamed, marching down the driveway and waving her hands wildly. "You cannot park that ugly thing here. This is private property. We are in the middle of moving." The driver calmly looked down at his clipboard. "Are you Jasmine Lawson?" he asked in a loud, flat voice. "Yes," she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "And I am telling you to leave immediately." "I am not here for you, madam," the driver replied, pulling a heavy steel chain from the back of his truck. "I am here for the vehicle. This Mercedes is registered as a corporate asset to Crestview Real Estate. Since the company is currently in default and undergoing total asset liquidation, the Harrington Trust has authorized the immediate repossession of this vehicle. Step away from the car, please." Jasmine let out an ear-piercing shriek. "You cannot take my car!" she yelled, lunging forward and physically placing her body against the grille of the G-Wagon. "It is mine. My husband bought it for me. It is a gift." Derek suddenly burst out of the front door of the mansion. He looked absolutely terrible. His face was unshaven, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was wearing a wrinkled gray shirt. He sprinted down the driveway toward the tow truck. "Hey," Derek yelled, trying to summon his old booming executive voice. "Stop what you are doing right now. I am the vice president of that company. You have absolutely no right to touch that car. I will call the police and have you arrested for grand theft auto." The driver did not even flinch. He simply handed Derek the thick stack of legal documents containing my signature and the federal court seal. "You were fired 2 days ago, sir," the driver stated firmly. "The Harrington Trust holds the lien. Go ahead and call the police. They already have copies of the seizure orders. Now step aside, or I will have you cited for obstructing a legal recovery." Derek stared at the paperwork. The fight instantly drained out of him. He stepped back, leaving Jasmine standing alone in front of the car. The driver quickly hooked the heavy steel chains to the front axle of the Mercedes. The commotion had attracted an audience. Several wealthy neighbors had stepped out of their custom-built homes. Women in expensive jogging gear and men walking purebred dogs stopped on the sidewalk to watch the spectacle. The Oak Ridge subdivision thrived on gossip and appearances. Derek and Jasmine were the ultimate prize. Jasmine realized she was being watched. Instead of retreating inside, she completely lost her mind. She threw herself onto the perfectly manicured green grass and began sobbing hysterically. She beat her fists against the lawn, screaming that her life was completely ruined, while the tow truck loudly hoisted the front of her luxury SUV into the air. Derek stood on the driveway, completely paralyzed by the public humiliation. The former golden child was reduced to a pathetic spectator, watching his stolen wealth disappear, while his wealthy neighbors filmed the dramatic meltdown. I took a sip of coffee and smiled. While Jasmine was screaming on the manicured lawn, a much more severe operation was unfolding downtown at the Crestview Real Estate corporate headquarters. I had handed my fully encrypted forensic dossier over to Mr. Gallagher the previous afternoon, and he had immediately forwarded it to his highest contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal authorities do not waste time when they are handed a perfectly packaged wire fraud case involving millions of stolen dollars. At exactly 1 in the afternoon, 3 black government vehicles pulled up to the front entrance of the Crestview building. A dozen federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the letters printed boldly across the back marched straight through the revolving glass doors. They completely bypassed the stunned receptionist and swarmed the executive floor. My former colleagues, the exact same people who had watched me being escorted out just days prior, were now pressed against the glass walls of their cubicles in absolute shock. They watched closely as federal agents stormed into Derek's corner suite. He was sitting helplessly at his desk, likely still reeling from the morning repossession of his wife's luxury vehicle, when the lead agent ordered him to stand up and place his hands behind his back. The former golden child did not put up a fight. He was completely broken. The agent secured heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists and loudly read him his rights. They marched him out of his office down the long corridor and straight through the crowded corporate bullpen. Every single employee watched the vice president of the company being paraded out like a common criminal. There was no arrogance left in his posture. His head was bowed, his face flushed with the ultimate humiliation as he was loaded into the back of a federal vehicle parked on the busy city street. While his only son was being aggressively processed at the federal courthouse, Richard was frantically locked inside his own office, desperately trying to salvage his rapidly collapsing empire. The 24-hour deadline to repay the $15 million commercial loan was rapidly approaching. Richard foolishly believed his sheer charisma and his prestigious social network could save him. He pulled out his leather-bound contact book and began aggressively dialing the private numbers of his wealthiest associates from the Oak Ridge Country Club. He called commercial real estate developers, elite hedge fund managers, and private bankers he had played golf with for over 20 years. He pitched them a desperate story of a temporary cash flow issue, begging for a short-term bridge loan to cover the massive debt. He offered outrageous interest rates and promised heavy equity in his future projects. But the response was uniformly brutal and swift. Word travels incredibly fast in elite financial circles, and the sudden spectacular collapse of Crestview real estate was already the biggest gossip of the day. What Richard did not realize was that I had already completely severed his financial lifelines by activating the default clause through the powerful Harrington Trust. I automatically triggered a catastrophic credit event across all major institutional banking networks. Apex Capital Holdings had officially flagged Richard and his entire company as a severe flight risk and a direct target of an active federal fraud investigation. Every single time Richard called a bank, their risk assessment algorithms immediately rejected his application. He was financially toxic. One prominent senior banker, a man Richard had considered a close personal friend for decades, finally gave it to him straight over the phone. The banker told Richard that his credit profile was completely blacklisted by the Harrington Trust. No reputable financial institution in the entire country would dare lend a single dollar to a man who was actively being liquidated by a billionaire estate. Richard slammed his office phone down so hard the plastic receiver completely cracked. He stood entirely alone in his massive executive suite, surrounded by expensive artwork and imported furniture he could no longer afford. He looked out the large glass window at the city skyline he used to claim as his own territory. The harsh reality of his situation finally crushed him. He was not just broke, he was financially radioactive. His son was sitting in federal custody, his company was effectively seized, and his pristine country club reputation was completely obliterated. He had spent 34 years building a massive fortress of lies on top of my stolen inheritance, and I had effortlessly demolished it in a single afternoon. I closed the live video feed of the driveway on my laptop and took another calm sip of my warm coffee. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had meticulously calculated. My toxic family had finally learned that actions carry severe consequences, and the absolute truth always wins in the very bitter end. Sunday morning arrived. For Richard and Cynthia, it was a desperate battleground. Despite their son sitting in a federal cell and their company accounts being completely frozen, they made a collective delusional decision. They were going to attend the exclusive Sunday brunch buffet, like every single week. Cynthia spent 2 hours applying heavy makeup to hide her swollen eyes, squeezing herself into a bright floral designer dress. Richard put on his finest navy blazer. They truly believed that if they simply acted like everything was perfectly normal, the wealthy elite would ignore the massive federal raid dominating local news. They thought their pristine social status could somehow act as a shield against their total financial ruin. They pulled up to the grand entrance of the Oak Ridge Country Club in Richard-leased luxury sedan. The young valet, who usually greeted them with a wide smile and a rush to open their doors, hesitated for a fraction of a second before approaching the vehicle. Richard tossed the keys to the young man with his usual practiced arrogance, completely ignoring the awkward silence. Cynthia linked her arm tightly through his, pasting a rigid smile onto her face. They marched up the wide marble steps and through the heavy glass doors into the bustling grand lobby. The club was packed with the most influential families in the city, mingling over mimosas and fresh pastries. The moment Richard and Cynthia stepped into the main dining hall, the ambient chatter instantly dropped by half. Dozens of eyes darted in their direction. Whispers erupted at tables near the entrance. People they had known for decades suddenly found their expensive champagne glasses incredibly fascinating, refusing to make any eye contact. Richard and Cynthia ignored the glaringly obvious social freeze and walked directly toward their usual premium booth by the large bay windows. Before they could reach their table, a man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped directly into their path. It was Mr. Preston, the general manager of the Oak Ridge Country Club. He did not offer his usual warm handshake or polite bow. His face was entirely stern, his posture rigid and unyielding. Richard immediately tried to take control of the interaction. "Good morning, Preston." Richard boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the hushed dining room. "We will take our usual table. And please send over a bottle of the reserve Prosecco. We have a lot to celebrate today." Mr. Preston did not budge a single inch. "I am afraid I cannot do that." Mr. Lawson, the manager, replied, his voice projecting clearly across the suddenly silent room. "In fact, I must ask you and your wife to leave the premises immediately." Cynthia gasped, her rigid smile finally cracking. "Leave!" she repeated, her voice pitching upward in panic. "What on earth are you talking about? We have been premium members of this club for 25 years. Mr. Preston pulled a folded piece of heavy cardstock from his inside jacket pocket. "That membership has been officially terminated by the board of directors as of an hour ago," he stated coldly. "You are currently trespassing on private property." Richard's face turned a violent shade of crimson. "You cannot do this to me," he hissed, leaning forward aggressively. "I demand to speak to the board president right now. I have invested thousands of dollars into this facility." Mr. Preston stood his ground, unfazed by the hollow threat. "The board president is the one who drafted this notice," he replied loudly, ensuring the surrounding tables heard every single word. "Your membership has been permanently revoked due to severe violations of our community conduct clauses. Specifically, your account is significantly delinquent on unpaid club dues. Furthermore, the Oak Ridge Country Club maintains a strict zero-tolerance policy regarding criminal association and felony financial fraud. We cannot have our prestigious institution linked to a federal embezzlement investigation." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. The entire dining room was watching them. The wealthy neighbors who had attended my disastrous birthday dinner were now staring at my parents with pure, unadulterated disgust. There was no pity in their eyes, only the harsh judgment of a social circle that violently expelled anyone who threatened their pristine image. Cynthia began to tremble uncontrollably, her hands clutching her designer purse as if it were a life preserver. Two large security guards in dark suits silently materialized behind Mr. Preston, their presence a clear indication that this was not a negotiation. "Please hand over your club access cards and follow security to the exit," Mr. Preston ordered. "Do not make us involve local law enforcement." With shaking hands, Richard pulled out the two platinum access cards and dropped them onto a nearby table. Defeated, humiliated, and completely stripped, they turned around. They walked out now, totally destroyed forever. 2 weeks passed since my parents were publicly exiled. The dust was settling over the wreckage of their former lives. I was restructuring the Harrington Trust portfolio. Despite my sudden wealth, I kept my routine normal. I did not buy a flashy sports car. Instead, I purchased a quiet, understated dark gray luxury sedan. It had bulletproof glass and top-tier security features, but looked like a standard vehicle. I appreciated the anonymity it provided. On a brisk Tuesday afternoon, I stopped by an upscale grocery store to pick up fresh produce. I was pushing my cart out the automatic doors when a chaotic movement caught my eye. A disheveled woman stepped out from behind a concrete pillar in the parking lot, moving erratically toward my vehicle. It took me 3 seconds to recognize her. Cynthia looked absolutely unrecognizable. Her signature blonde hair was unwashed and pulled back into a messy knot. She wore an oversized beige trench coat, and her face was pale. The arrogant suburban matriarch was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, broken woman fueled by raw desperation. She had clearly been tracking my movements. As I reached my car and unlocked the trunk, Cynthia broke into a frantic sprint. "Audrey," she screamed, her voice cracking violently. "You look at me right now." I calmly placed my bags into the trunk and pressed the automatic close button. I turned around and leaned against the rear bumper, crossing my arms. I did not flinch. "You are an absolute monster!" Cynthia shrieked, stopping just a few feet away. She pointed a shaking finger at my face. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, filled with hatred. "Do you have any idea what you have done? Your brother is in a federal holding cell. Jasmine completely abandoned him. Richard had a minor heart episode because the bank foreclosed on our property. We have absolutely nothing left. We are living in a cheap motel." Cynthia paused, gasping for air. She expected me to crumble. She expected the desperate scapegoat who always fixed everyone else's mistakes to suddenly offer her a lifeline. I looked at her with absolute indifference. "I warned you to leave me alone," I said, my voice completely flat. "You built a life on stolen money, Cynthia. The consequences are your own. Now step away from my car." My cold response pushed her over the edge. She lunged forward, slamming her hands against the tinted glass of my rear passenger window. "You owe us," she wailed, her face contorting in agony. "We are your family. You cannot destroy us and live a billionaire life. I will never let you have peace. I will follow you everywhere. I will make sure the world knows what a treacherous daughter you are." I calmly walked past her, opened the door, and slid into the plush leather seat. I started the engine. The powerful purr of the luxury car masked her frantic breathing. Cynthia rushed to my window, pressing her palms against the glass, preparing to scream. I lowered the window just a few inches. Cynthia leaned in eagerly, thinking I was going to engage in the toxic screaming match she craved. But before she could speak a single word, a tall man in a plain gray suit stepped out from behind a parked vehicle nearby. I had hired a private security firm, and a plainclothes security operative had been shadowing me discreetly for exactly this kind of scenario. The man walked briskly up behind Cynthia. "Cynthia Lawson?" he asked in a loud, authoritative voice. Cynthia spun around, startled by the sudden interruption. "Yes," she answered, blinking in confusion. The man pulled a thick white envelope from his jacket pocket and pressed it firmly against her chest. She reflexively grabbed it. "You have just been served," the man stated professionally. "Step away from the vehicle immediately." Cynthia looked down at the heavy envelope, her hands trembling. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I looked at her through the partially opened window. "That is a permanent, legally binding restraining order," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "It mandates that you, Richard, and Derek must remain at least 500 feet away from me, my residence, and any property owned by the Harrington Trust. If you attempt to contact me again or approach me in public, my security team will immediately call the police, and you will be arrested for violating a strict court order." Cynthia stared at me, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. The heavy white envelope slipped from her fingers and hit the asphalt. "Enjoy the cheap motel, Cynthia," I said smoothly. I rolled up the tinted window, put the car in drive, and pulled smoothly out of the parking lot, leaving her standing entirely alone there forever. 6 months passed since that afternoon in the grocery store parking lot. The transition from forensic accountant to the billionaire head of the Harrington Trust was a chaotic but ultimately seamless evolution. I did not just inherit an empire, I completely sanitized one. The toxic entity formerly known as Crestview Real Estate was legally dissolved and entirely absorbed into Apex Capital Holdings. I systematically fired every single executive who had blindly enabled my toxic family to embezzle corporate funds, immediately replacing them with a brand new board of highly vetted, ethical financial professionals. We implemented aggressive compliance protocols and transparent accounting practices. Within 2 quarters, the restructured firm was not just surviving without Richard and Derek. It was thriving, pulling in record profits through legitimate, sustainable commercial developments. While my new company flourished, the people who once treated me like a worthless nuisance were facing the bleak reality of their actions. Derek never even made it to trial. Faced with the mountain of encrypted forensic evidence I handed over to the federal prosecutors, his expensive defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal. He officially pleaded guilty to 2 counts of major felony wire fraud and 1 count of massive corporate embezzlement. The judge was not swayed by his former country club pedigree. Derek was sentenced to 4 years in a federal correctional institution. The golden child traded his custom Italian suits for a standard-issue khaki uniform. He now spent his days working in the prison laundry facility, earning pennies an hour, entirely stripped of the unearned arrogance that had defined his entire adult life. Jasmine did exactly what she promised to do in the boardroom. The ink on Derek's indictment was barely dry before she filed for a highly publicized, ruthless divorce. She desperately tried to distance herself from his crimes to save her social media brand. It completely backfired. The federal authorities had aggressively seized her designer handbags, her luxury jewelry, and the mansion, leaving her with absolutely nothing but a severely damaged reputation. Her wealthy followers vanished overnight, refusing to associate with a convicted felon ex-wife. Today, Jasmine lives in a tiny studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. She spends her days posting heavily filtered videos from her small kitchen, desperately trying to sell questionable detox teas and cheap hair gummies to a rapidly shrinking online audience. The glamorous influencer lifestyle she valued above human decency is completely dead and buried. My parents suffered the most precipitous fall from grace. Stripped of their stolen wealth and blacklisted from every elite circle in the state, Richard and Cynthia were forced to face the brutal reality of the working class they used to openly mock. They currently reside in a cramped, outdated two-bedroom rental apartment located directly above a noisy bowling alley. To make rent and pay off the mountain of legal debt they incurred during the bankruptcy, both of them had to find employment. Richard, the man who used to scream at me for questioning his authority as a chief executive officer, now works exactly 40 hours a week as a basic customer service associate at a massive local hardware store. He spends his days wearing a bright orange vest, directing contractors to the plumbing aisle and sweeping up sawdust. Cynthia, who once hosted lavish charity galas and constantly sneered at my wardrobe, took a job as a receptionist at a low-tier dental clinic. She answers phones and schedules cleanings for minimum wage, completely isolated from the wealthy socialites she sacrificed my biological father to impress. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk in the corner suite of Apex Capital Holdings, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline. The morning sun illuminated the bustling streets below. My encrypted work laptop sat open in front of me, displaying a perfectly balanced multi-million-dollar quarterly profit report. There were no hidden offshore accounts. There were no fake vendor invoices. There were no fraudulent expense reports to silently correct. The financial foundation of my life was finally built on solid, undeniable truth. For 33 years, I was the designated punching bag for a family of parasites. They demanded my constant gratitude while secretly draining the fortune that rightfully belonged to me. They mistakenly thought I was incredibly weak just because I quietly kept my head down and did the complex math. But the math never lies to anyone. It simply waits for the right forensic auditor to read the detailed ledger. I took a slow, deep breath of the cool, conditioned air, picked up my heavy gold fountain pen, and confidently signed my name at the bottom of a legitimate 9-figure corporate acquisition. The scapegoat era was officially over. The new Harrington legacy had finally begun. Later that evening, I left the corporate headquarters and took my private elevator up to the top floor of the newly acquired Apex Tower. My new home was a sprawling multi-level penthouse overlooking the entire city. It was a massive upgrade from the cramped two-bedroom rental I had lived in for years, while my family stole my inheritance. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glittering downtown skyline. The space was incredibly quiet. There were no arrogant brothers slamming doors, no hysterical mothers demanding attention, and absolutely no fathers belittling my existence. There was only the peaceful hum of the central air conditioning and the soft glow of the city lights reflecting off the polished hardwood floors. I walked over to the massive marble kitchen island and poured myself a glass of expensive sparkling water. I stood there for a long moment, simply breathing in the absolute freedom my new life provided. The suffocating weight of my toxic family was permanently lifted from my shoulders. I was no longer the designated punching bag, the financial janitor, or the desperate daughter seeking validation from people incapable of love. I was completely autonomous. I set my glass down and walked into my expansive home office. The room was decorated in minimalist tones of charcoal and ivory, designed specifically for focus and clarity. Resting in the exact center of my sleek glass desk was a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. These were not corporate acquisition contracts or commercial real estate ledgers. These papers represented the true purpose of my newly acquired wealth. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and opened the top folder. The bold heading at the top of the first page read, "The Harrington Foundation." Over the past 6 months, while I was aggressively restructuring the corporate side of my empire, I had also been quietly working with Mr. Gallagher to establish a massive philanthropic organization. The mission statement was simple but incredibly powerful. The foundation was specifically designed and heavily funded to provide immediate, comprehensive legal and financial assistance to women who were actively escaping toxic, abusive family dynamics. I knew exactly how financial manipulation was used as a weapon to keep victims trapped. My mother had literally sold me for $2 million, And Richard had used that exact same money to control every single aspect of my life. Toxic families thrive on creating financial dependency. They use money to enforce compliance, demand loyalty, and punish anyone who dares to speak the truth or step out of line. I wanted to give other women the exact same weapon Vincent Harrington had secretly given me. The foundation would fully fund expert forensic accountants to track hidden family assets. It would pay for aggressive corporate lawyers to fight bogus defamation lawsuits and break illegal non-disclosure agreements. Most importantly, it would provide emergency housing and immediate cash grants, so these women could walk away from their abusers without ever looking back. I wanted to completely dismantle the financial cages that toxic families use to imprison their targeted scapegoats. I picked up my heavy gold fountain pen, the exact same pen I had used to legally bankrupt Richard and Derek in the boardroom 6 months ago. The metal felt warm and familiar in my hand. I carefully signed my name on the final signature line of the incorporation documents, officially transferring $50 million of my personal inheritance directly into the foundation operating budget. The ink dried instantly on the thick paper. The Harrington Foundation was now a legally binding, fully funded reality. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the massive window at the city below. The transition was finally complete for me today. I had taken the worst parts of my past and weaponized them into a tool for absolute justice. I thought about Richard sweeping dirty sawdust in a local hardware store. I thought about Cynthia answering ringing phones for minimum wage. I thought about Derek folding cheap prison laundry inside his cell. They had spent 3 decades trying to convince me that I was fundamentally flawed, a worthless burden they gracefully tolerated every single day. They thought a DNA test would prove I was nothing. Instead, it proved I was everything they could never be. Family is not just about blood, it is respect. I slowly closed the folder and rested my hands on the glass desk. The legacy of Vincent Harrington was no longer a secret hidden in an offshore bank account. It was a beacon of hope for anyone fighting to reclaim their stolen life. Have you ever had a family member's toxic joke backfire on them spectacularly? Tell me your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe.